what I'm going to be focusing on is sort of what's happened to the labor market and how we've recovered quite well, actually, and where we're sort of sitting right now. So, there's a lot that's unprecedented about the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said before, we've all had our own experiences with it, but the labor market impact is equally unprecedented. And that's going to include both the initial upheaval, the job loss that was experienced early on in the pandemic, but also then the rate and the robustness of the recovery that took place relatively quickly. Now, the labor market's not out of the woods just yet, but it has vastly improved. And so we'll see that by the end of this, there's actually a lot to be optimistic about looking at the labor market. And this is especially, though, if you're a job seeker. It is certainly a seller's market right now in the labor market, whereas employers are having a bit of a harder time. So in terms of my talk, first, I'm going to talk about the upheaval and the recovery. And so that'll be, I guess, a little bit more than a third of it. Then I'm going to talk about the current state of the labor market, where we are now, and then touch on some lingering concerns. Just a point that Emily mentioned before. So do feel free to ask questions as I'm going along, especially questions that are related to the topics that I'm talking about in terms of, when I'm talking about the upheaval and the recovery. If you have questions about that, those are great times to ask them. And so I'm happy to take them throughout the talk, not just at the end. But the plan will be to roughly talk for about 45 minutes or so, and that'll leave us about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to answer some questions. So I'm sure most of you can remember what you were doing or where you were back in March 2020, when the economy essentially shut down. Just in terms of a definitional thing, a recession is a slowdown in economic activity. And at the time, I remarked several times and several times since, I've never quite so clearly in my life seen a slowdown in economic activity with your eyes. Economic activity just essentially ceased. And for lots of elements, for an economist, that was very interesting to observe. And so what we're going to do today is we want to sort of analyze this recession using data and statistics from the job market. I think they really do a good job of capturing the changes that have occurred over the last 2 years. And of course, my topic is going to focus entirely on the economy and not other impacts that were also occurring, of course. So here's a figure. Let me talk you through what this shows you. It's a lot of numbers, so let me talk it out through. So what this is over time, this is beginning in March or in 2020, before the pandemic. So up in the upper left-hand corner here, you have January 19th to 25th of 2020. So this is before the pandemic hit. And what you have here are data on firms and the number of hours that were being worked at firms. And it's a ratio of the number of hours worked during the week of January 19th to 25th to the week prior to that. And so you see the ratio is most frequently around 1. Just from week to week, a firm is going to have roughly the same number of hours worked when they add up all of their employees. And what this shows is sort of the evolution and the onset of the pandemic. And so as we move forward in time to the last week in January and the first week in February, this is all going to just be the ratio of the hours in the firm relative to that week before the second week in January. And so what you see over time is, there's some spreading out in this distribution of hours worked. Essentially, businesses will expand and contract. And so you would expect this to change over time, just naturally through the course of business. And you see that the probability of a firm going out of business and so having 0 hours worked does increase over time. This is not necessarily the pandemic. Firms just fail. What's interesting is that as you follow this over time, you see that it gets flatter and flatter until exactly this third week in March. As I said before, we probably all remember where we were, that the end of the second week of March or the third week of March, when sort of this realization that the COVID-19 pandemic was here and was going to stay, and all of the consequences associated with that. And so what you observe is leading up to that period, you see some firms, cutting back hours, but then this dramatic shift in this distribution of hours. And so what this is showing is essentially, firms just shutting down, a lot of them shutting down or just way cutting back hours from that second week of March to third week of March. By the fourth week of March, look, we've got 35% of businesses are now working 0 hours and essentially all cutting back. And so what I like about this figure is it just really shows, okay, life was going on as normal in early 2020. And then, this realization that the pandemic was hitting us. And we see this dramatic decline in the number of hours of work at businesses. They weren't necessarily all going out of business, but they were temporarily closing. And then by the third week of March, the first week of April, essentially all, or not all, but quite a number of businesses closed down. You get to see some of that upheaval. You can see it here as well. And thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, I say here, no shock has hit the US economy as hard or as fast. So if we think about where we were in February 2020, prior to sort of the recognition that the pandemic was really here, the unemployment rate in the US was around 3.5%. It was at a 67-year low, and 158 million people were employed. What the figure here shows is the number of new unemployment claims, and it starts in 2019. I apologize if you have a hard time seeing this, and then into 2020. And these are weekly unemployment claims. And again, then beginning in that third week in March, there's this huge jump up. This increase from the second week of March to third week was a record and continued to jump up the number of unemployment claims. So what we see is that by the end of March, 10 million had filed for unemployment. And then by April, another 20 million had filed for unemployment. So total employment in the US labor market went from essentially 160 million down to 130 million in a matter of 6 weeks. And that really is quite dramatic. So the costs of all recessions tend to be unequally felt, right? So if we think about a recession as sort of being a contraction in economic activity, if GDP falls by 2%, it's not usually the case that everyone's income falls by 2%. It's usually that a small percentage of people experience a very large shock. And the same thing was true with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so who were disproportionately hurt by the impact of this job loss was largely lower paid workers. Why were lower paid workers hurt? Two factors, really. One, that those jobs were much more difficult to do remotely, but also the sectors where low-income individuals tend to work were in the low-skill service sector, things like hospitality and leisure, exactly where we saw a lot of the job loss. Women, too, as well, disproportionately experienced the initial job loss, and that largely also relates to the idea that they tend to be more employed in the service sector, where we saw a lot of the job loss early in the pandemic. And so we can see that here in these statistics. So this is from the US and from the UK. So this is the share of job loss by income level. And so you can see, again, it was largely concentrated in lower income individuals in the US, and the same thing in the UK, where essentially lower income individuals disproportionately experience that job loss. This is a figure that shows the disproportional impact on women. So what you have along the axes here are the different recessions we've had over the last 70 years, and then whether those recessions have disproportionately impacted men or women. So these are relative differences in the percent decline in employment. So women were 3 percentage points more likely to experience a job loss in the COVID-19 pandemic. This was very different from all previous recessions, which had disproportionately hit men. When we look across sector, as I said before, a lot of this job loss was in low skill service sectors. And so you can see that especially in leisure and hospitality. So if we look at the total job loss from February to April of 2020, we can see that total employment declined by about 8 million jobs in the leisure and hospitality sector. The next biggest was trade, transportation, and utility. So that's a lot of retail jobs. but also transportation and other utilities. But the trade there is retail trade. But generally, it was in service sectors. So we see retail, we see business and professional services, and then leisure and hospitality. And so that's why low income, low wage workers and women were disproportionately impacted. So that was sort of the initial state. And you can see this initial impact of the COVID-19 recession in the unemployment rate as well. So what I'm showing here is over time. You can see this is from 1992 all the way out to 2022. And it's showing the unemployment rate over time. The shaded areas here are the recessions. And so again, you can sort of see the unprecedented nature of the job loss that occurred with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The unemployment rate went from about, as I said, 3.5% all the way up to 15% almost immediately in about a 6-week period. Again, unprecedented, never been an increase like that before. But what I want to also start to show you here is the recovery. So the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic is equally unprecedented. And so if you look at the rate at which the unemployment rate has declined just over the last 2 years, looking from 2020 to 2022, we can see it's declined all the way back down to about 3.5%. And that drop was relatively quickly, especially in the first 8 months after the pandemic. So by the fall of 2020, it had already dropped back down to about 7%. And then it's been a little bit of a slower recovery over the last 18 months, but still quite continuous improvement. I just want to make a point of reference here to sort of point out sort of the unprecedented nature, right? So if we think about the Great Recession, which is what is shown here, it's shaded, looking from 2008 to about the middle of 2009, we can see the unemployment rate was just under 5% before the Great Recession hit. It shot up not as high, up to 10%. But look how long it took for the unemployment rate to come all the way back down to 5%. It didn't come back down to 5% until sometime in 2017, right? So essentially 9 years later, it took for the unemployment rate to come back down to the level that it was prior to the Great Recession, whereas the recovery from the COVID recession occurred over a period of 2 years. We see that dramatic recovery here as well. When we look at, this is now total employment. Again, over time, this is looking from, looks like 2005 all the way to 2022. And this is total employment in the US economy. Again, we can see sort of the unprecedented nature of the employment decline. We see that 30 million employment decline from just under 160 million to just above 130 million or almost 30 million decline. But then the robust recovery that was very rapid at first, but has stayed quite gradual. And so if you look at it now, we're not quite, even though the unemployment rate, we can see the unemployment rate is back to where it is. Total employment level is not exactly back at it. I think I looked at the numbers, we're like 500,000 or so below where we were, but we're almost at the level of employment where we were prior to the recession. So again, a very rapid recovery. And when we look at that sectoral recovery, it's fairly broad-based. If you remember what I showed you before, for example, leisure and hospitality, they had lost early in the pandemic, I forget right now, but I think it was 7 or 8 million jobs. So leisure and hospitality is still down about 1.5 million jobs. But that's still quite a recovery there from 7 to 8 million back to 1.5 million down. But you can get a sense of where we are. This is as of March 2022, and these are the changes since February 2020, so pre-pandemic. And so we see some still declines in some of the service sectors that have been hurt, education and health. You might be surprised that the healthcare sector was hurt by a COVID-19 pandemic, but a lot of people stopped getting a lot of the elective surgeries that they would otherwise had. And so the healthcare sector has been hurt. Education has been hurt in terms of declining employment, but leisure and hospitality is by far the sector that's been most hit. On the other hand, you see the growth. Some sectors have grown Professional and business services was one of the sectors that have experienced the second largest decline, I think, in the initial job loss, but it is fully recovered, and now there are 720,000 more jobs in the professional and business service sector. And so you see that also in things like transportation and warehousing. So the fact that we now all get our goods, we use e-commerce even more than we did previously, that's sort of reflected there. But you can see generally broad-based recovery, but there still is some differences across sectors where they haven't fully recovered. In terms of, to give you a sense that, me talking about the labor market recovery represents a recovery in the overall economy. What I'm showing you here is GDP. And so you can see GDP over time. This is again GDP from 2005 to about to the present, 2022. We can see the Great Recession here, and we can see the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw GDP fall from about 22 trillion down to about 20 trillion, so almost a 10% contraction there, but quite a bit of recovery. By 2021, we were back at the same level of GDP, and now we are sort of almost on the same trajectory. Again, to sort of connect this recovery to the Great Recession, one thing I want you to notice is look at what happened with the Great Recession here. If you can sort of see that we were sort of on this trajectory here, the Great Recession hit, but the trajectory, of the economy essentially never recovered. If we draw sort of a straight line here, I'm not getting a good straight line there, but if we draw sort of a continuation of the trend, right, we can see essentially the US economy never recovered from the Great Recession. And so this is sometimes seen as when a recession hits, right, if you don't, essentially you miss out, it leads to a permanent decline in economic activity, because essentially you don't often catch up to the previous trend line that you were in terms of economic growth. But now I want to sort of draw your connection or your attention to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you sort of draw a line here, sort of connecting this thing out, you'll see that we have almost already caught up to the trajectory that we were on prior to the pandemic. So there was this dramatic decline, a fairly rapid recovery, but it's not just a recovery in terms of, our old level, that we're actually on more or less a very similar path that we were prior to the pandemic. And this is really actually quite impressive. And I'll talk a little bit more about, why that is. So scale and the pace of the recovery, really quite amazing, right? So as dramatic as the job loss was, 30 million jobs disappearing in 6 weeks, our recovery, first initially over the 8 months following, but then the subsequent, the first 6 months, but then over the subsequent 18 months, has really been quite dramatic. So how did this happen? How did we recover so quickly from this recession versus others? So one thing I think that's important to recognize is that, really, this is a recession that was caused by the pandemic. And prior to the pandemic, there was really nothing fundamentally wrong with the economy. And so as the pandemic eased, right, people became, we're going to have differing opinions about the pandemic easing or whether people just became more accustomed to it. The underlying economy, though, is fairly strong. So as COVID eased, we went back to this fairly robust and strong economy. But a second point that is really important is just the recognition that the US government passed a tremendous amount of economic stimulus in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's not random that they did this. So if I go back one slide, a lot of the criticism that came out of the government response to the Great Recession was that we were not aggressive enough in the amount of economic stimulus. And so even though the US was better than places like Europe, we were not aggressive enough. And so we ended up on this lower level of economic activity. And so the belief was coming out of the Great Recessions that we really needed to be more aggressive in the amount of economic stimulus that you provide. So to refresh your memory, like there were three major stimulus packages. So first off, there was expanded unemployment insurance. And so this directly targeted those individuals that lost their jobs because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what this did, it was an add-on. Not only could they collect UI for a longer period of time, but UI usually pays somewhere in the range of about 50% of your income up to some cap. And so expanded UI added some additional money on top of that. And so individuals that lost their jobs were largely made whole in terms of their income. And so they didn't necessarily experience the same job loss. In addition to expanded UI, there was the Paycheck Protection Plan. And this was essentially money that was given to businesses that they could receive this stimulus if they held people on payroll. So not go out of business, not lay people off, but to hold them on payroll for when things improve. And so that would, lower what would have been, the amount of job loss. The third thing that really happened, though, was that there were multiple rounds of direct stimulus payments, and these were quite substantial. And so all of these things, what they did is they prevented this, if we think about the COVID-19 pandemic hits, everyone, stops going and using their local services. They stop going to restaurants and hotels. They just stay home. It prevented this sort of economic shock that took place in the service sector from having some major spillovers into other areas of the economy. And so this is really important that the government was able to keep that isolated. The other thing that the money did was that it ensured that when the COVID-19 pandemic did ease, that there was this robust demand for consumption, right? So all of that money, right? And especially if you think about during the pandemic, it was hard to consume money early in the pandemic, right? You couldn't go anywhere, so you weren't really spending any money. So if you didn't lose your job, your savings went up. And then at the same time, you were getting these stimulus payments. And so people were sitting on cash when the pandemic eased. And so that creates this robust demand. And so individuals are not going to be hesitant to go out and spend money. And that actually aids in the recovery to sort of like start up the economic engine again and get things going. And so the stimulus was really important. And as I said before, this was a lesson learned from the Great Recession. So just to show you how large these effects were, by the way, this is what I'm plotting here. This is billions of, this is personal income. So what personal income is, when you add up all of the earned income that individuals receive, the capital income, right? If people have assets and they earn money on their assets that they receive, and then also any transfers from the government. So whether it's stimulus payments or other transfer programs, something like the earned income tax credit. So all that stuff gets added into personal income. And so again, you see personal incomes going up over time. Look what happened in the pandemic. Personal income shot up, right? And this is those stimulus payments. It shot up from, if we go across here, from about 17 trillion to 19 trillion. It went up 2 trillion almost immediately. If we look, backwards in time, personal income had not gone up 2 trillion in the previous 5 years. And then overnight, personal income went up $2 trillion. Those stimulus payments at first went away, and you can sort of see the additional rounds of stimulus payments with these additional spikes here. But you get a sense of, wow, the stimulus that occurred from the government really was quite substantial here, and really not nearly as much when we look at other recessions. You see little bumps from, there was a stimulus payment during the Great Recession, but nothing even close to where we were. Again, if we sort of think about trajectories, this was temporary increases through those government stimulus, but where are we now? We're pretty close. We're not exactly on the trajectory that we were. And I will point out that this is real personal income. And so part of the reason why we're not sort of on this trajectory here, it's starting to come down, is inflation is now starting to eat into the real value of that personal income. But really a robust government stimulus. And so we can see that robust stimulus increased personal consumption. So this is personal consumption drops. in the COVID recession and then bounces right back. And here we can see our personal consumption is on the trajectory that we were before. Again, this is also real, adjusting for inflation. And now, if you're worried, oh, is this just a consumption response, right? Does this type of government stimulus have any legs? Is it going to persist? I'm going to show you investment here. If you look at business investment, you see, again, the pandemic see business investment decline, but business investment robustly grow out of it. And looking at this business investment figures is really one of the things that does give me some confidence in thinking about the economy going forward, is that businesses are actively making investment decisions, thinking that economic activity in the future is going to be good. Tends to be that, when if we look here prior to the Great Recession, that business investment tends to decline before a recession. So business investment, you might say, is a leading indicator for a recession, and we don't see any evidence of that here. And so the stimulus really quite effective. So where are we now? So thinking about the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery, we're sitting at a point where the labor market is actually in quite good shape, right? As we showed before, employment levels are essentially at the level that they were prior to the pandemic. They're a little bit lower, but more or less at the same. Unemployment rate is at the same level. Consumption is back on its pre-pandemic trend, and businesses are investing and expanding. And so all of this is leading to positive things in the labor market, and especially for job seekers. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are now with sort of job openings, quit rates, and then ultimately a little bit about labor force participation, where the labor force participation is the share of all people either employed or actively seeking work. So when we look at where we are now, we are at record levels of job openings. So never before has the economy had over 11 million job openings, which is exactly where we are now. Again, this is sort of showing total number of job openings over time, over the period 06 to 2022. And we see, again, job openings tend to decrease in a recession. A lot of individuals get more conservative, and people are less likely to quit when they're worried about being able to find another job. And so we see those job openings fall, but then this robust recovery with both the increased investment by business and increased consumption by individuals. So very good news. These job openings are also broad-based. It's not just leisure and hospitality where a lot of the job loss occurred. It is essentially across all sectors of the economy, as the demand for goods across the economy is fairly high. And so businesses are trying to expand to meet that demand. And so they're looking for labor in that regards. So at the same time, though, it's sort of interesting, what's driving these job openings. One piece of it is that, as I said, that there's this increase in demand for goods, and businesses want to expand to meet those goods. And so then businesses start looking for more workers. But the other thing that the pandemic has done is it's increased the quit rate. So maybe you heard of this term, the Great Resignation. What this shows here is over time, the share of people that are quitting their jobs every month. As I said, people, quit rates tend to go down in recessions, as you see here, as you see early in the pandemic, right? In April 2020, you would be crazy to quit your job. So, you see that in all recessions. But over time, right, those quit rates increased. And maybe when you look at quit rates, you might think that this is evidence of a problem, right? Some of the elevated quit rates, might then that individuals and particularly women needed to, there was more work that needed to be done in the home, and women on average tend to do more work in the home. And so one effect of that might be that people start quitting their jobs so that they could, help with children's schooling or other types of home activities. But as it continued to rise, high quit rates is also indicative of actually a really robust economy because people tend to quit their jobs when they think they can find another one. And so this is sort of indicative of individuals searching for more jobs. And so there was sort of this question for a while, okay, quit rates went from about 2.5% to about 3%. First off, you might think, well, that's not necessarily that high. But remember, this is 0.5% of 160 million. So it's almost like quit rates went up about almost a million. A million more people are quitting their job every month in the US. So these are pretty substantial. And sort of at first, there was sort of this thinking that maybe people were leaving the labor force for good. But what we've seen as we've sort of followed up on this is it's not really a great resignation, but a great reshuffling. We can see that if we look at the labor force participation rate here, the number of people that are either working or looking for a job declined, but we're almost back at the level here that we were prior to the pandemic. And so what it says is individuals are quitting their job and looking for new jobs. And so these elevated job openings, right, are coming from business expanding, but also they reflect workers recognizing that they have market power right now, and so that they're going to seek out better options. Individuals' preferences may have changed in the pandemic in terms of what they want from their job, whether it's different benefits or more flexibility or higher wages, and so that these quit rates are not really indicative of people quitting the labor force, but really, I think most of the evidence now is pointing to looking for better jobs. Just in terms of these quit rates, they are sort of across all industries. This is not just one sector of the economy. They really are sort of broad-based, right? So why are many people, quitting their jobs? I think that, as I said, the top reason is workers really want to find better jobs. And it takes time. So job openings here reflect the fact that workers are quitting, businesses are expanding, but that as workers move from one job to another, and as employers are seeking out new employees, finding that right match, it does just take time in the labor market. And in this way, right, the pandemic changed what people's preferences are in terms of what they want, in terms of out of their work. And then, there's going to be some aid here of the stimulus, leftover stimulus or savings from the pandemic mean that, right, some workers can look for a longer period of time and can be pickier. And this is not necessarily a criticism of the stimulus as being a bad thing, but sort of realigned the balance of power between employers and employees. The other reason, by the way, that there's quite a bit of job openings is not just that workers are quitting, and as I mentioned before, that there's robust demand for goods, and so firms want to expand production. But when you look at real wages, and I don't have a figure for this, but real wages have not actually increased very much in the pandemic. So employers are trying to hire workers, but they're not pushing up wages just yet. And so firms are really hesitant to do this. So, firms, you can understand from the firm's point of view in terms of wanting to get the most they can for the least amount of money to make the most money. And once they raise wages, it's very difficult for firms to lower wages. There's one thing that workers really don't like is wage cuts. And so once firms raise wages, if they do it too quickly, essentially they're going to be at that permanent level of higher wages. And so firms have been really hesitant to raise wages. Why aren't firms raising them quicker? Maybe it speaks to firms thinking about this sort of choosiness of employees as being temporary. And if it is, if workers are able to be more choosy in the short run because they have, leftover stimulus or leftover savings from the pandemic, then it would be temporary. But on the other hand, if this is really about workers changing their preferences for what they want, and maybe individuals being content to sort of, or households be content to have less and maybe do more home production, then this could be much more long lasting. The third reason, though, there is a third thing that when we think about these job openings, and this one is a slight potential cause for concern, and sort of reflects that this sort of imbalance in the labor market, right? Because when we have these elevated job openings, it does sort of imply that there's some imbalance. There are workers out there that want jobs, they're job openings. So you might ask yourself, why aren't they finding each other and creating matches? The other thing that the pandemic did is it's not only changed our preferences about what we want with work, but it really changed our preferences for how we spend our money and how we spend our time. And so, for example, early in the pandemic, right, nobody was going to restaurants or traveling anymore, right? And suddenly everyone wants to expand the size of their house. And so you can't easily take workers from, say, the leisure and hospitality sector and just slide them over into the construction sector, and they're going to be equally productive. Workers tend to be productive in certain areas, but not necessarily in all areas. And so this sort of reallocating workers from declining areas, if preferences have changed about what we want to buy, and they move to other things that we want to buy, there is a slow process of getting productive workers from the declining areas to the expanding areas. And if this is what's going on, then this imbalance in the labor market will persist could persist for a while. All right, so for the most part, the recovery has been quite robust and quite positive. And so we might wonder, well, what are sort of the lingering concerns? What are the things that are out there that should give us pause in trying to think that this recovery could sort of be off track? Because right now, in a lot of respects, the recovery, in terms of the labor market anyway, has gone about as well as you could expect. So the lingering concerns out there, which of course you guys would probably all guess yourself, is inflation. So the question is, can the Federal Reserve rein in inflation without causing recession? So inflation is bad from the point of view of the labor market, and if it spills over into wages, and employers start just increasing wages of workers, then we could end up in a cycle where higher wages for workers lead to higher prices of goods, which lead to higher wages for workers. You end up in this inflation spiral, this wage inflation spiral. So the Federal Reserve is not going to want this to happen, and so they're going to be raising interest rates. I think they're going to be announcing today. Maybe they just announced, but they're going to be raising interest rates pretty aggressively over the next, probably over the next year, but quite aggressively over the next 6 months. And the question is whether they can do that in a way that doesn't lead to a large slowdown in economic activity, because this would definitely then spill over into the labor market and slow down the recovery, maybe sort of get us off track of the recovery we're on. The other sort of things that are out there, of course, is still the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic is ultimately what caused this recession. And so to the extent that COVID-19 mutates and comes back in the US in an aggressive manner, that will also impact the US labor market. And it's also important to recognize that, this is not just COVID-19 in the US, this really is COVID-19 around the world. The world economy, and especially the US economy, is highly interrelated. So for example, the things that are occurring in China right now certainly affect consumption in the US as it becomes harder to get a lot of the goods that are produced in China, but then will spill over into the US labor market. Lastly, geopolitical concerns, thinking about Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thus far, geopolitical concerns have largely just added to the inflationary pressure in the US and sort of made it even more difficult to address some of the inflation issues. But it doesn't have to remain that way. It could spill over and have a more direct effect rather than just through commodity prices, through prices of grains and prices of oil and so forth. So there might be more direct effects there. So just sort of overall and sort of summarizing up, the impact of the COVID-19 on the labor market really unprecedented. The scale of the job loss in such a short period of time, that just the complete seizing of economic activity, but then also the rate of recovery over a 2-year period to find ourselves back on employment levels almost back to pre-pandemic levels, and GDP and consumption back on the levels that we were before. So the rate of recovery largely due to, as I said, the underlying health of the economy and the scale of the government intervention. And so, from the point of view of the labor market, there are other, inflation being one, there are other problems in the economy, but the labor market is really in quite good shape. And this is especially, as I said, from the point of view of workers. We really have a seller's market out there. Workers are in the driver's seat here. But the lingering concerns remain, issues about things like inflation, COVID-19, geopolitical concerns. And so the continued recovery of the labor market and the economy overall depends a lot upon what happens in those areas. So that just sort of gives you a quick summary of sort of where we've been over the last 2 years, and how we've bounced back, and sort of the continued challenges that persist.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I mean, there's certainly a lot to take in and a lot that we can discuss here in these next 15 minutes. I know we have a couple questions already in the Q&A. So yeah, as a reminder, again, if you have other questions, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is where you can submit them. We'll be trying to go through as many as we can today. The first question I'm not particularly familiar with, admittedly, I don't study economics, but this person asks, what about the trend among companies like Amazon or Facebook raising their base max pay? And is there anything as part of that that leads to an influence or a trend among other competitors, specifically in terms of hiring, or anything that you'd want to expand on there?
Yeah, so I did say at some point, right, there isn't a lot of evidence that there's been robust wage growth, that employers are responding to these openings by raising wages. There is an exception to that, and it's exactly what the attendee pointed out, which is at the low end of the labor market. So employers where you do see fairly robust wage growth is sort of in the bottom quartile of wages. So while the average worker, while middle, the median worker, or the higher end workers are not necessarily seeing wage growth that has kept up with inflation, at the bottom end. So for example, the Amazon example there, you do actually see quite robust wage growth. I saw some number recently that said, for the lowest wage workers, pre-pandemic to now, are seeing wage growth of about 20%. So really quite substantial. Those are nominal, so they would still be real gains controlling for inflation, but quite substantial. But overall, not so much wage growth in sort of the middle upper end of the distribution.
Great, thank you. This next question, someone says, is it possible that opportunistic market manipulation might be driving some of the inflation, specifically things like, I think it's supposed to be natural liquid and compressed gas?
So, in specific cases, possibly. I'm not familiar with, is it liquefied natural gas? Is that what, with specifically with the industry dynamics in the liquefied natural gas market? But overall, most of the evidence is not really pointing to a market power story here. That most of the evidence is pointing to a range of factors. One, increase in demand, right? If suddenly more consumers want goods, and firms have not expanded their capacity, you're going to raise your prices to think about, you're not going to, a profit maximizing firm is going to raise its prices. So demand has grown quite a bit. And there's been inabilities by firms to expand their capacity, right? So if we think about inflation again, you have this robust demand for certain goods, but businesses aren't necessarily able to scale up really quickly. And some of that has to do with the pandemic, some of these sort of shipping backlogs. But I think, something else I raised earlier is also important, which is the way that our preferences, if we, the buyers out there, what we want to buy have all sort of changed in lockstep key. Into, for example, like I said, we all wanted, to expand our houses. And then, suddenly now we're all wanting to travel again. And so there have been these runs on sort of like individual goods. And the way that the economy is set up is you can't necessarily just, reallocate the productive capacity to what the goods that individuals want at that moment, and then switch it back to the next one. So these combinations of things like, demand, and the way that our demand is sort of highly correlated with each other, and sort of the inability both of the labor market to adjust and capital markets to adjust to create those goods, I think are the biggest factors that are out there. Market power in some small instances may be at play, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence to broadly support that idea.
Thank you. Yeah, that was certainly helpful. One additional question, you talked a little bit, you just touched on it here, and you talked a little bit about it in your presentation and talking about reshuffling and sort of reallocating where the opportunities and the job opportunities are. I think one thing that we often read in the headlines is that there's a shortage of skilled labor. Is that something that's correlating with sort of this reshuffling and the number of jobs reopening? And could you just discuss that a little bit more? It seems like it was something that was also talked about before the pandemic, and of course, so much has changed then, but just expanding upon that.
Yeah, I think it is exactly about this idea that, when you move, workers from one type of industry to another type of industry, their skills don't necessarily translate, right? And so the pandemic not only changed what we want, it also maybe changed how businesses make goods and how they sell goods. And so that leads to increases in demands for different skills than there were prior to the pandemic. And, as much as we'd all love to just be able to snap our fingers and suddenly be, a skilled programmer or a skilled, robotics worker or something, that's just not how it works. It takes time. And so when you have a situation where either production is changing quite dynamically, or what consumers want is changing quite dynamically, and you need to reallocate people across sectors, that this sort of skills gap really does come into play.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, we have time for a few more questions, so feel free to submit them again using the Q&A question. Yeah, I think one additional question, I think, again, you touched on this throughout the presentation, but one thing I'd be curious to hear you expand upon is in terms of like the shift to virtual work. Has that also sort of like underlied the reshuffling, and any predictions in terms of also generally like different industries and looking at how we're shifting to in-person or coming back, what impact that'll continue to have on the job market? Again, thinking like if people are coming back to the office and now they're driving more and there's an increase in gas, and sort of the interplay of how remote and in-person work is impacting that labor market.
Yeah, so really want to make 2 points there. One, to the extent that virtual work and working remotely is here to stay and is actually going to expand, perhaps, that should actually ease some of these sort of frictions, if you will, of moving workers, because it's not just necessarily sort of a skill mismatch when we think about the labor market. Sometimes there is sort of a geographic mismatch, that sort of where the production or the employer is not necessarily the same place as where the job loss is. And so reallocating geographically across space can also create a drag on trying to recover from some sort of economic shock. To the extent that, that people can work remotely, though, that sort of solves a lot of those geographic reallocation issues, the moving costs and stuff, where, maybe people don't want to leave where their family is or where they've grown up, or they just don't want to move. So it should ease it, and it should actually make it so that the labor market adjusts more easily. To the extent, though, that that virtual work is not the same as in-person work, and that the interactions that you have with your colleagues maybe are not as good, and maybe then there's going to be a decline in the amount that individuals are allowed to work remotely. That's going to be a drag on the response, the recovery, in part because 2 years is still a long time, and some people have actually moved because they could, and getting them back to the office is not just getting in the car and commuting, or getting on the train and commuting. It's literally moving back to the city where you were, and so that could be an additional drag. Plus, I think a lot of individuals really enjoy working remotely, or at least enjoy the option and the ability to do it some of the time. And so to the extent that employers are going to take that away, it's going to just create another bargaining chip where there's going to be disagreement between what the employer wants and what the worker wants. And so that just sort of slows down the recovery. So it could kind of go either way, depending upon whether there's sort of this virtual work stuff persists, or whether it sort of decreases.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I recently read an article similarly that was talking about the housing market in the Sun Belt and certain places that used to be more vacation destinations, and how now, if you have the opportunity to work remotely, why not live in Charleston or Tampa or these places, and how it's impacting the housing market, because they're making the cost of living wages that they had made living in New York and in different regional areas, which, to your point, is just an interesting phenomenon.
From like sort of a regional economic activity point of view, it really could be quite good. I mean, if you look what's happened in the US over the last, 30 years, has been a real concentration of economic activity and wealth into a few select cities, and a decline in economic activity in lots of rural areas and smaller cities. But to the extent then that this sort of virtual work or remote work allows people to sort of reallocate, that would then spread out the productivity gains to a broader part of the country, and not just be concentrated in those select coastal cities.
Yeah, well, I think that's about all the questions that we have today. Of course, thank you all for joining us so much. We're so appreciative of you spending your lunch hour here learning about, again, a really helpful and important topic right now. So thank you all for joining us. Dr. Phelan, thank you so much also for joining us and for leading this really thorough and just super interesting presentation. So at this point, we'll wrap it up. I'm sure we're almost right at that 1 o'clock hour. So yeah, we'll wrap it up for now. Again, if you want to revisit any of this, we'll have the recording available. Just email us at alumnievents.depaul.edu. But otherwise, yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.